Hi, this is Stephen Brower from Red Valley Community College. This is for CSIT 256, Computer Architecture and Assembly Language. Other than the overview video, there was a video for Chapter 6 on magnetic disks, and there was a video for RAID. So other than the overview video, this is the leftovers. This is everything. This is everything that the magnetic and the RAID was not. Okay, and this is take 2. Take 1 was a disaster. This is take 2. So solid-state drives. Now, solid-state drives would use flash as the underlying media for recording the information. And flash is something we did take a look at in Chapter 5 on internal memory. Now, the magnetic disk video showed things like the read-write heads that would move in unison, that the disk would rotate to move the platter under the read-write head. There were moving parts in magnetic disks. Well, solid-state drives, nothing moves. So the access time, which is the seek time plus the rotational delay, that's not an issue with solid-state drives. So the reads from the drives are much faster. In terms of price per bit, the solid-state drives are more expensive. And it is now an option for, like my laptop does have a solid-state drive. I have a 500 gig solid-state drive, and booting is very quick with it. One of the downsides of solid-state drives is that over time, eventually, they will slow down. So there is sort of a certain lifespan to it. That wouldn't necessarily be the issue with magnetics. So the slides for Chapter 6, the author has one of those pro-con solid-state versus hard disk drives, HDD, comparing them. Okay, optical. Many letters in this section here. But let me oversimplify it just to give a high-level description. Optical is using lasers. Low-intensity lasers for reading, high-intensity lasers for writing. And depending on which kind of drive we are referring to, then it either has one or the other or both, or even different kinds of lasers. In terms of the surface of an optical disc, there are lands and pits. So pits would be holes burned into the surface. Lands would be, well, absence of holes. And so it's these holes and lands, these pits and these lands, that would be representing the ones and the zeros. So a high-intensity laser would burn in those pits, and it would not burn in a place where we wanted a land. In terms of reading it later, a low-intensity laser is detecting, well, are we at a pit or are we at a land? So the early drives that we were able to get for our computers, the first ones that we got, they were just CD-ROMs, read-only memory. So they only had a low-intensity laser, and all they could do was just read. They actually couldn't write. Now, in terms of the disks that were being read, how those disks were made, well, kind of depends. And what I mean by it kind of depends, if we take Microsoft, for example, they used to distribute software on optical. Yeah, I know. Actually, I'm so old. One of the installs I did one time was SQL Server running on a LAN manager server, and it was 17 floppy disks that I had to go through for the installation. Kill me. You guys are soft. You don't know how hard it used to be. Anyway, going back to Microsoft, they used to distribute their software on optical disk. What they would do is they would burn one disk. So they would have a CDR. A CDR will burn the pits. Well, it won't burn it for a land. It will burn it for a pit. But a CDR will make these permanent holes into the surface of the optical. And so what Microsoft would do is they would write one disk. And if they were happy with that one disk, they would make a mold out of it, and they would stamp out all the other optical disks that were needed that they were going to distribute, like to Staples or wherever the stores were. So what I'm getting at, the CD-ROM, the drives that we were reading, weren't necessarily created in a computer. They were replicas of a disk that was created on a computer. So I just wanted to distinguish the two, just to kind of mention that. So initially we only had CD-ROM drives, just read-only. That's all we could do. Then CDR, that started working its way into the home, and what we were allowed to do is we could then make one write to a disk. We couldn't change it, but at least we could make our own CDs. So a CDR drive had both a low-intensity laser and a high-intensity laser. The high-intensity laser was for burning these pits. The low-intensity laser was for sensing the lands and the pits. There were two different approaches. Well, let's just say there were evolved two approaches for CD-RW. And one of them that I do want to mention is the phase change that was used for CD-RW. The idea was, instead of burning a pit, it would change the reflectivity of the surface of the optical surface, or of the disk surface. And if it was reflective, it would be considered one thing. If it wasn't reflective, it would be considered the other. So instead of using lands and pits, it was kind of using opaque and reflective, if that's the right thing. And what it could do is it could reheat the surface. And by reheating the surface, it would all flatten out, become reflective again. And then it could just then change the parts that it wanted to be not reflective. So with the CD-RW is that we could write back to the CD again. Compared to dealing a hard drive, it's much slower, and actually I should have mentioned the CDR, that write, since it's much slower. What optical disc manufacturers would have on their the literature for, or the wrapping for it, they would say the maximum of writes that it could have. In the old days, they had these things called computer fairs, and nerds like me would go to them, and we try to buy all these really cool things. And sometimes, you could get a box of CD-RWs for like $1, and you go, oh wow, this is a great deal. But you read the fine print, and it's like 25 writes. I'm exaggerating a bit, but the idea was that the cheaper media had a lower number of writes. The more expensive media had a higher number of writes. So I only talked about just the phase change. I just think it's kind of interesting the way that one was done. Okay, so if for CD-ROM or for CDs, if we have the lands and the pits, then DVDs, well, there are still lands and pits. It's just the pits are smaller and they're closer together. So the first generation of DVDs, it was just the surface of the disc that was being written. We didn't get to multiple layers until later. But because the pits were smaller, in other words, they refined the technology, the pits were smaller and closer together, you can get more data onto a disc, and then therefore enough data for a video. And so at home, and I didn't put these letters here, actually I missed some letters. So a DVD-ROM would only be able to read a DVD, meaning it would only have the low intensity laser for detecting the lands and the pits. A DVD-R would have a high intensity laser so it could burn the pits, and then a low intensity laser for sensing the pits. The DVD-RW, well, it's similar. For the ones that were phase change, were like the CD-RWs. So it's the same thing where you had reflective and non-reflective parts, and it could reheat the surface and then change the reflectivity. And it's just because it's DVD format that those reflective parts were smaller and closer together. Eventually, what came up is Blu-ray. And this is where I'll get myself in trouble, but I don't really care. But it is going on YouTube. I really should be careful about it. Tropic Thunder. Check out the movie. I'll just say that, because they talk about Blu-ray in it, and they explain it very well. All right. Now let me talk about how some companies will use some of these items. Publicly traded companies have to report to the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. And when they report to the SEC could go to that company later and say, re-show us what you had reported to us 3 years ago, first quarter. And so the company has to be able to produce in an unalterable form what that information was. So what some companies would do when they would have those reports that were being sent to the SEC, they would make sure they burn onto optical using lands and pits, making sure it was permanent and that it couldn't be changed. They would burn onto the CD that information because they wanted it in a non-changeable format. Same thing, the Food and Drug Administration. So if you're filing a patent and you have to submit a whole bunch of information to the FDA, you want to make sure that's in a non-changeable state. So there is the CDRs still being used because they're using it as having an unchangeable copy of data that can be read later. Anyway, that's one thing in terms of how that is being used. Okay, in another course that I teach, we talk about things like disaster recovery, of which part of disaster recovery is backing up. And what some companies will do is they'll use either DVD-R or CD-R as being sort of their master copies of data at a point in time. Like they may use it for their grandfathers in terms of a well, I'm jumping ahead. What a number of companies will do is on a daily basis, all they do is back up just the incrementals, what has changed. And then once a week, they will do the full backup. Well, what they'll do is they'll hang on to those full backups. And the other thing they'll then do is they'll hang on to one of those full backups for a month. They'll hang on to that for a multiple period of time. And so some companies are using CDRs, or they're using optical as a way of burning information to. Some of them are using tape. And so even though there are a number of companies that are just pushing things to the cloud, and then there's another copy of it on the cloud, and they're even using hot spares where data is being written to two servers simultaneously, that magnetic tape is still used for backing up data. In terms of like bits per inch, it is the cheapest. It's not fast. And so remember that hierarchy from chapter 5, the one that had registers at the very top of the pyramid? Magnetic tape is the bottom. It is the slowest, but it is the cheapest. And so some companies are still using magnetic tape for backing up their data. So the author does show the different formats that are used for magnetic tape. And I guess the other key thing is that the magnetic tape, it is sequential. And so if you're looking for a piece of data, you have to go sequentially through all the data to find what you're looking for. Technically, optical is also, I'm gonna really butcher this, but optical has one track that's kind of spiraling out from the inside. This is a really bad drawing, but I'm spiraling out of control is what I'm doing. Okay, and it's not supposed to be that big. I just have lousy hand-eye coordination, but that's supposed to be the spiral. So in optical, it's really one track where the data is written. And remember how for magnetic disk, one of the things we saw was there was the ID field and then the data field. Well, there's something similar in terms of optical. For the data block that's being written, there's an ID to identify it. Well, what the optical drive will do is it will randomly go to where it thinks the place is that it's looking for, and it'll start reading. And depending on what it's reading, it knows whether to move the head in or out based on a track that's there. But because it can do that so quickly, it makes it seem as if it's random access. Although the data is sequential, it can actually then find where the data is, and so it feels like it's a little more random access as opposed to being sequential. But the tape is just sequential. I'm really butchering this.